Hi, my name is Denali Graham, and this is my cellular communication research project for Professor Dent's class, Language and Culture and Society, ANTH 1004. When his oral presentation was first assigned, I immediately decided I wanted to do research on GIFs and texts, but I didn't know what specific attributes I wanted to focus on. After some thought, I outlined some basic questions that I wanted to investigate. My main questions were, why do cell phone users use GIFs? How does GIF use supplement non-verbal cellular communication? In what frames are GIFs considered appropriate/inappropriate, and why? And what problems does inappropriate GIF use cause in communication? I then took these questions and condensed them into a thesis. My thesis was, in text messaging, GIFs are primarily limited to humorous exchanges between peers and serve as a way to provide facial expression to an expressionless medium. GIFs originally interested me because I use them so often and have been using them for over 4 years. But thinking back, I couldn't pinpoint any specific reason why I began using GIFs. They weren't included in any sort of update on my phone, and I had to download an app to begin using them. I wanted to know the answers to why I felt the need to include GIFs as a texter. In addition to my curiosity about their function, GIFs are also popular at the moment, and so finding interviews with experience with GIFs would not be difficult. It was these two reasons that made me commit to researching GIFs. Over the next few slides, I'll address the methods I used in my research project. Along with my results, I've also included an explanation of the complications that arose during my research and the solutions I was able to find. My research broke down into two main categories: interviews and inscriptions. For my interviews, I mainly drew from social circles that I'm already a member of, which narrowed my demographic to roughly female college students. Many of my interviews were with rugby players, a few interviews were conducted with parents. Overall, these interviews were conducted with people that I had a pre-existing relationship with. This meant that the interviews themselves were very casual and informal. Within the interviews, I prepared myself with a list of main questions along with a list of alternative questions depending on the responses I received. In addition to these interviews, I referenced inscriptions involving GIFs. These inscriptions took the form of screenshots of text in which a GIF was used and the response of the sender or receivers. After completing my interviews and collecting my inscriptions, several patterns appeared in my research. Many interviewees said that they only use GIFs in humorous situations and that they primarily receive GIFs from their peers. They also, for the most part, believe that GIFs are only a part of texting and not their own form of communication. There are some results that I was not expecting, such as the frequent mentioning of Vine, which is another social media platform involving 6-second videos. In addition to Vine, I was not expecting so many interviewees to say that they would be interviewees to be able to say they'd be able to hold a conversation using only GIFs, considering these same interviewees had previously said that GIFs are just a part of texting as opposed to their own form of communication. These unanticipated results threw me for a loop, and I realized that I had a lot of interesting interactions which I could focus on in my research. During my interviews, I did run into a few problems. Some interviewees didn't know what GIFs were, they didn't use them. These were mostly interviews with older people. In these cases, the questions that I prepared did not make sense to ask, and I had to revise my interview questions. Other interviewees brought up a similar form of communication called Vines. These are 6-second videos that include audio and are currently popular among younger generations. When addressed with these discussions on Vines, I was temporarily interested in changing the direction of my research to focus on Vines instead of GIFs. However, the more I researched Vines, I determined that Vines were used less frequently in texting and more in face-to-face conversation. Because this presentation was supposed to focus on cellular communication, I made the decision to continue researching GIFs instead of Vines. Another issue that I encountered was vocabulary in my interview questions. One question that was often met with more questions was, in what context would you not use a GIF? Many interviewees did not know what I meant by context. In these cases, I had to further explain that by context, I meant situations or tones, such as a professional interaction or a serious conversation. Once the interviewees better understood the questions, the answers came more easily. The difficulty for the interviewees lay not in finding a response for the question, but in knowing what question was being asked. At the end of my interviews, I found 3 major concepts that played a significant role in the use of GIFs in messaging: mediation, pragmatics, and identity. These topics are very broad, so I'll address them individually with more detail. The role of mediation in GIF use seems kind of obvious, so at first I overlooked it. Once I broke down the parts of language that are associated with GIFs, I was able to step back and identify the importance of mediums in GIFs. Primarily, GIFs are sent within text messages, which is a medium notorious for misunderstandings of tone and emotion. Oftentimes, this trouble communicating effectively is associated with the lack of facial and tonal cues. This is where GIFs can come in handy. While many text conversations do not provide any facial expression, GIFs offer a way for participants in the discourse community to compensate for this flaw. While GIFs do not provide audio, the combination of the expression from the GIF and the speech from the text serves as a way to mimic face-to-face conversation. For example, in this inscription, the text "cool as a cucumber" is combined with the GIF to express a more complete visual picture to the receiver. The receiver will use both of these messages to replace the lack of real face-to-face conversation. This understanding that GIFs are used in a medium that is often considered expressionless provides more insight into the logic of why people use GIFs. The next concept that I found to be significant to the use of GIFs in cellular communication was pragmatics. Pragmatics cuts across the main domains that make up language: phonology, semantics, syntax, and morphology. Ultimately, pragmatics looks at the factors, aka circumstances, that govern our choices in language. It contradicts Chomsky's argument that context and situation don't matter in terms of language, and that grammar and structure are more important when understanding a language. In terms of GIFs, the circumstances in which GIFs are used are often found to be very uniform. Most were used in humorous contexts, either to add humor to a funny conversation or to push a conversation to a more humorous tone. For example, in this inscription, the GIF is used to keep the conversation from drifting into a downcast tone. The statement about the closing shift had the potential to bring down the conversation, and the GIF prevented that by adding humor. This humor-based interaction involves a frame or a dynamic structure of expectations for the production and reception of discourse. Both the sender and receiver need to understand the structure of expectations associated with GIFs. Otherwise, one party could be perceived as rude or unintelligent. One of these expectations is that GIFs are to be used in humorous environments rather than serious or professional ones. Another expectation surrounding the use of GIFs is that they can only enhance a conversation. In other words, it's not impossible to hold an entire conversation through text with only GIFs, but it's not considered normal. Quoting an interview, "It's possible, but pointless." Most GIFs add to an already existing conversation, and so using GIFs as the main format for a conversation is considered unusual. These are just two of many examples on the importance of pragmatic frames in GIF use. Identity also played a large role in GIF use. When asked about who they sent gifts to and received gifts from, most interviewees stated that they are sent between peers. However, after an interview with a 49-year-old parent, it became clear that most gifts are actually sent among younger populations. Older generations are not as active in GIF use. When I asked why they do not use GIFs in their texts, most older interviewees, about 40 plus, responded along the lines of, "I don't know where to find them," or "I don't know how to use them." When compared to the younger participants, the difference in the understanding of the proper use of GIFs was blatantly obvious. The separation between ages or generations could be compared to differences between speaking in men and women, aka in terms of gender. Both groups speak the same language, but have different speech patterns. Women use more questions, encouraging noises, and exhibit a wider intonational range, while men interrupt, listen poorly, and introduce new topics. While this dichotomy is between genders and not generations, it is still comparable to the difference in use of GIFs between older and younger generations. A test of mutual intelligibility can easily be applied here. While speakers from two different generations would still be able to understand the same GIF, establishing that they speak the same language, one generation might not be as familiar with the use of GIFs and the implications associated with them as another. Ultimately, this variation in identity, in this case age, was a major factor in GIF use. At the conclusion of this project, I discovered that my thesis was proven correct. My interviews and analysis supported my belief that GIFs are primarily limited to humorous exchanges between peers and serve as a way to provide facial expressions to an expressionless medium. However, the size and demographic of my study both show room for improvement. Increasing my study size and broadening my demographic would establish a stronger stance on my thesis and would ideally become my next step should I continue my research.